Of the bioethics lecture series in this spring at Iowa State University. I'd like to call your attention to the fact that there will be another lecture in the bioethics lecture series. Brian Norton will be speaking here on February 20th on biodiversity and the Endangered Species Act, and I hope you'll all come out. He's a wonderful speaker. I also would like to call your attention to the Presidential University Lecture, Is Cancer Preventable? Diane Burt will be speaking here 1 week from tonight at 8 o'clock p.m. Her title is Cancer Preventable? So that will be a wonderful, wonderful event. I want also to begin by thanking all of the people who have supported the bioethics program and are either directly or indirectly supporting this event in the lecture series of which this event is a part. That includes the Plant Sciences Institute, the College of Engineering, the Biotechnology Office, the Ag College, the College of Family and Consumer Sciences, Arts and Sciences, and a number of people who have aided the program around campus. So my warm thanks to those who have made this series possible. Our guest tonight, Gregory Pence, is author of numerous books, which you can peruse at your leisure after the talk. I think one of the things that sets Gregory Pence's work apart is its clarity and its accessibility. Gregory Pence has been able to put very complicated issues, complicated moral and ethical issues, in very plain prose, and I think that's a great gift. His work in medical ethics is known throughout the country. He's one of very few bioethicists who have a subspecialty in agricultural and ethics and the ethics of food, and indeed his work, Designer Food, is one of the best known works in the ethics of food. He is professor at the University of Alabama in Birmingham, and also teaches at the medical school there. And it gives me great pleasure to introduce Greg Pence. Let me say one more thing. There will be a reception after the meeting, so for the diehards who would like to stay and discuss these issues, like myself, I hope that you will stay and partake. So, Gregory Pence, thank you very much.
Thank you, Clark, for that very nice introduction. From previous experience talking about food ethics, I know that if things go right, I will probably say something to offend everybody tonight. So if you're not offended, please don't feel neglected. Maybe I'll do a little better next time. I got interested in genetically modified food because previously, let me show you a little background. Wake up. I've been teaching bioethics since about 1976, and I lived through the brouhaha in the early 70s about in vitro fertilization, where people thought the sky was going to fall if we gave nature a little help and helped infertile couples have kids. And people predicted that, people like Leon Cass, and then we had Louise Brown, 1978. Didn't happen. You know, there's been thousands and thousands of kids created by assisted reproduction, and you know, it's a good thing. When Dolly was cloned, and people started extrapolating that to human beings, people also started saying that the sky's going to fall if we ever create a being by cloning. And there are real genetic problems with cloning, but most of the opposition from, again, people like Leon Cass is philosophical. That even if it's safe, the Cass Bioethics Commission is saying we should never do it because it's evil and wrong, we don't want to go there. And so one of my previous books is basically stupid things people think about cloning, all the different mistakes they make, not about abnormalities, but all the other stuff. And from that point, it was actually a natural kind of move into silly things people think about GM veggies, as I prefer to call them. Although things have gotten a lot more complicated recently. So I'm going to focus on GM veggies tonight, but also on meat. And really what I want to talk to you about is just kind of a stealth topic here, what wasn't really advertised, is food ethics. And why I think food ethics is poised in the next 20 or 30 years to become just the way medical ethics and bioethics has gone in the last 30 years. Because I think we're at the point where we're beginning to realize that food ethics is kind of the mind-body problem made personal. Food is what I am. What I am eat is food. I make choices about food that affect, sustainability and globalization. And I think we're all just beginning to be more conscious about the whole food system and our place in it. And I think one of the take-home messages tonight in my talk is that being more conscious about food and its sources increases your power over it and your ability to make choices. And I think there's one or two things you may learn tonight that may really surprise you, I hope. Maybe more than one or two things, but hopefully one or two. I'm going to present this as a kind of, as a philosopher. For professional philosophers, this is kind of watered down philosophy. I sort of apologize for how watered down it is, but there's a little bit of real philosophy in it. But it's also hopefully factually correct too, so the people in agricultural science and genetics will also not be embarrassed. So it's a tough job to do, but anyway, I'm going to try. So the first, talked about that. First, I want to talk about 4 food frames or worldviews. One is pretty intuitive, is naturalism. I think was actually, you can trace it at least back to Rousseau. And it's the idea that food should be simple and traditional, grown nearby. You should know the face of the person who grows your food. And that's a very intuitive, powerful idea. And many of us would like to have our food this way. I think the ultimate point of that kind of food is to grow your own. If you read the literature about food, and there's some very politicized literature. One of the things that surprised me is just in some areas just how politicized people's views about food are. There's a very strong social justice egalitarian movement about food that believes that food, and in some parts of the world, food is life. It's power, and it's very important to achieving justice and reforms to change the way the food system is set up, and it's also important to ending starvation. Part of this view sometimes is that instead of large agribusiness and huge farms with huge subsidies, we should have a world of small farms with locally grown produce and local markets, and that's the sort of ideal for the world. I think Vandana Shiva, the Indian activist, writes that way and advocates that kind of thing. Wendell Berry, well-known American essayist, writes that way. You get that idea sometimes from Jeremy Rifkin. Whether that's possible, we'll talk about a little bit later. We are increasingly moving towards a global food supply. There's the basic idea is that this is a good thing, if you believe in free trade, that not every country should grow every kind of food. I mean, Iowa doesn't necessarily grow sugar, as well as Cuba and the Philippines. Ecuador, off the coast of Ecuador, seems to be growing most of the shrimp for the world. We're getting increasingly Vietnamese catfish that our Senate says are not really catfish because they compete too much with American farmers. But the idea is that some people are specialized in something and do it better, and you can get good cost efficiency if you do that. And maybe some countries should grow coffee and others should grow corn, and we should just exchange, and everybody will be better off and the consumer will benefit. At least that's the global model. And, whoops. And finally, there's what I call sort of euphemistically the scientific progressive model, which is in some ways neutral, and says that what science gives us are just tools. Tools are always good. There's no such thing as a bad tool. It's the people who are good or bad and use them. People are good or bad, not tools. And that we should never take a tool off the table. So if we can genetically modify soybeans or corn or cotton, that's good. Certainly don't destroy the technology or just not study it. I think you can make the same argument about embryonic cloning. Why take something off the table that might help people, might create stem cells that might really be a boon, as some people want to take it off the table. Really, a lot of things started happening about food ethics about 4 or 5 years ago. Vandana Shiva has certainly become fairly famous. She's written books about biopiracy, very much a critic of globalism and American agribusiness, critic of Terminator genes and genetically modified foods, has quite a following. I think the flashpoint for many of us about how this was suddenly becoming an international issue occurred in Seattle, where I have two sisters, and I know they were shocked when people sort of went on a rampage trying to disrupt the WTO and its meetings, trying to set agreements about genetically modified food and other things. And for a lot of people, it was the first time they'd ever heard of the WTO. And what is this sort of organization, and how does it affect international commerce so much? And why are people that are college age, so upset and rioting about this? I mean, it was on the cover of Time and Newsweek, and it really is the first time I think it came to consciousness for a lot of people. And just this September, there was another WTO meeting in Cancun, and thousands of college-age students went down there, burned American flags, stormed barricades, protesting something. So somebody cares enough to give up, their typical thongs and beer vacation in the Cancun and actually get in there and protest. And at least you got to give them credit. I mean, people care about this enough to get out there and do something. There's also people. Last week there was the economic summit at Davos in Switzerland. There was 1,000 people protesting outside, although it didn't make a lot of newspapers. Oops, sorry. Greenpeace has given up whales for the most part and chosen genetically modified food as its new cause. Some of these slides are a little bit fuzzy. I apologize for that. This is kind of an interesting switch, and it has some political consequences. Greenpeace is sort of the premier naturalist organization who believes in keeping the environment pure, and they are sort of categorically against genetically modified food and plants and vegetables, even maybe in some cases where it's hard to justify. They've gone around. I was up in Orono, Maine, where they had a kind of, it's kind of interesting, they had a trial crop of starling corn, and they wanted, corn pollen's heavy, and they wanted to see how far it would go and whether it would contaminate any of the corn. They had various kind of buffer zones, but before they could run their experiment, Greenpeace activists came in and mowed it all down. So even if it might have been dangerous, they didn't have a chance to prove that because it was just ripped up. And of course people did this in England, and were the people in England were so traumatized by mad cow disease that when Monsanto tried to introduce genetically modified food, they were just sick of any kind of innovation. And Greenpeace has really milked this very well in England. The people that were charged of the crime were let off by the jury. Were very sympathetic. Monsanto, now Solutia, has really been seen by egalitarians as naturalists, as the Darth Vader of the agricultural movement. And it is true that biotech companies have generally not focused on developing crops that help the poor. That's absolutely correct. But one of the things you have to ask is Monsanto a charity? Most college professors and their parents have money invested in stock funds who want return on their equity. And if Monsanto doesn't bring some kind of return to its stockholders, people are going to buy its stock, and it's going to go out of business. So one of the questions philosophically is whether a big company like Pfizer or Monsanto should be basically in the business of charity, whether the federal government or the United Nations would actually be doing the charity. I'm not sure if it's fair, in other words, to ask a for-profit company to try to solve famine. If you read the egalitarian naturalist literature, food scientists come out as the bad guys, which is kind of amazing. They especially distrust food scientists who work for universities or food companies because they think that the people who are paying their paychecks are people who have ownership in biotech companies are on the take. And they're going to be biased and only in favor of intellectual property favoring ownership of genes and food companies. And really, this I think is part of a larger picture that comes especially from Hollywood. You see this also in reproductive medicine and medicine. Try to think of a movie where a scientist is presented as a real hero. I mean, there's 1,000 movies where scientists are, represented as Dr. Frankensteins, as arrogant Dr. Strangeloves, greedy. I mean, maybe Raiders of the Lost Ark, Harrison Ford, but he's an anthropologist. I don't know if he's a real scientist. Maybe. I don't probably offend the anthropologists now. Jeff Goldblum in Jurassic Park, well, he's kind of crazy. He's kind of scatterbrained. Supposed to be Heinz Pagel. Really, there's not a lot of positive images that come out of Hollywood. There's a new movie coming out based on Jonathan Patterson's novel When the Wind Blows. It's about a reproductive clinic in Boulder where the evil scientists tell the parents their kids have been born stillborn, but actually what's happened is that all the girls that have been genetically enhanced and they have wings. They're like Arnold Schwarzenegger girls with wings, and they escape, and the evil scientists have to go out and try to hunt them down with telescopic rifles, and of course the good veterinarian, who will probably be played by Meg Ryan, gets to save them. But the biotech scientists at the assisted reproductive clinic are very definitely evil in this movie. I think that basically there are a lot of food scientists who are actually good, and I was very pleased when West Wing featured last year Jeremiah Bartlett saying that everybody should know the name of Norman Borlaug, who I believe was born here in Iowa. A man who, wouldn't you like to have this written on your tombstone, that because you lived and because you worked, 1 billion people will live who might have died? That's a pretty great thing to have achieved. Because of his work on dwarf wheat, shuttle wheat, a lot of food has been produced. There's a guy named Paul Ehrlich who many years ago predicted that billions of people would be starving now. We'd run out of food. And it didn't come true. And people have a short memory. Ehrlich has a new book out, and people sort of don't call him on his previous population bomb junk. But Norman Borlaug, who won the Nobel Peace Prize, is certainly a good scientist who's in favor of GM veggies and thinks that they're a tool that we can use to solve some problems in the world, and the sky won't fall if various places start to grow them. One of the conceptual things that I like to point out as a philosopher is contradictions and problems. And naturalists and egalitarians are usually allies, but these two worldviews kind of clash at times. Not all the things they believe are compatible. For example, egalitarians would like to have a world of small farms. Wendell Berry would like this. Is this possible? Vandana Shiva would like a world where basically manure is the only thing used as fertilizer. Is this possible? Can we all be organic? I don't think so. There's about 6 billion people in the world, and they're busily, trying to produce more. And if we gave up chemical fertilizers, and we needed to produce all the food organically through manure, we would have to create a lot of manure-creating critters. We would need a lot of manure. It's been estimated we'd have to clear all the rainforests and all the wildlands to produce that much manure for organic farming. It is not sustainable to have the whole world fed organically or even on small farms. We need certain economies of scale to feed the world as it is. America happens to be very blessed that we grow food well here. We haven't depleted our soils for 2,000 years. We have the right kind of combination of factors, if you read Jared Diamond, to produce food well. And in some ways, the world needs our farms. I just don't think the alliance between egalitarians and naturalists can hold on this issue. Another example of this is the Terminator gene. This is, whoever thought this up, this name, was a PR coup. It's like the people who get the Frankenfood costumes on. You can have 20 good arguments, but one guy in a Frankenfood outfit will be on the news at night because those are powerful images. Here's a guy, Mr. Terminator dressed as Kiss. Terminator genes are, but basically, it's hard to know where to start. Make the plant not able to reproduce. It doesn't have seeds. Because of this, they're perfect for worries about super weeds or super plants running wild in the environment because they don't reproduce. you would think that naturalists, egalitarians, would love this idea, right? Wrong. Instead of focusing on the good to the environment, they focus on the fact that every year farmers have to buy seeds and can't store seeds, and see this as an issue of intellectual property rights. So perhaps egalitarians are right to really focus on this, but naturalists should actually welcome terminator genes because they limit the damage to the environment for any kind of new genetically modified crop. Another way in which naturalists and egalitarians perhaps don't, this is another kind of viewpoint. From a globalist point of view, what happened in Brazil in the last 2 years is really a good thing. Brazilian government has more and more allowed genetically modified soybeans, and by doing so, it started to export millions and millions of dollars more of sales, created thousands of jobs. Some people say it's also taking land away from the Amazon, but that's probably going to happen anyway. But it is producing more of a sustainable economy in Brazil. And so from a global point of view, for creating jobs point of view, that's a good thing. Not necessarily a good thing to naturalists, but a good thing if you got one of those jobs. There's a real cost of globalism, though, of course. We know that as farms have become bigger and bigger in this country and been subsidized, perhaps wrongly to do so, more and more small farms have died out. People have lost their way of life. If we take globalism to the limit, a lot of things will change in the world. A lot of things will die out. And we have to think about whether that's a good thing. Both my grandparents owned farms in the Shenandoah Valley, Virginia, and I spent summers on farms. There's sort of a romanticism going on, I think, in some quarters about the small farm, Willie Nelson and John Cougar Mellencamp and their songs, and Wendell Berry. And a lot of people have hobby farms. There's a bunch of psychiatrists in Birmingham who are doctors and they have a hobby farm, and that's nice. I'm not sure everything about living on a small farm was good. If you really go back in time and talk about making your own shirts, or a lot of really hard, backbreaking labor on small farms. Certainly, my grandparents labored that way. I'm not sure plants really care that much whether their nitrogen comes from manure or chemical fertilizer, and not everybody likes living on a small farm and small town life. My mother was a single child raised on a farm, and she hated it. She hated small town life. When she was a teenager, she was a little wild, and everybody in town knew exactly what she did. And she just fled to Washington, D.C. because she wanted a better life. So it's not necessarily for everybody. Perhaps one of the most strangest issues of all is Greenpeace's opposition to allowing starling corn in Zimbabwe, which is a little bit north of South Africa. Zimbabwe is basically being run by a dictator, Mugabe, who I think is a little bit crazy. People are starving in Zimbabwe, and there is starling corn rotting on the wharves, which Mugabe is refusing to distribute, and he's using food as a weapon, as power. But one of the most hardest things to accept is Greenpeace out of London and Europe saying they really shouldn't distribute this corn. That locally grown markets should come about that are sustainable. You shouldn't be importing starling corn and the people of Zimbabwe and using them as guinea pigs. You know, if you were starving in Zimbabwe, I don't think you'd care where the corn came from. I think you just want to live. You want your baby to live. And I think Greenpeace, in this particular case, should get behind letting people live and not so much worried about the environment. We really don't need to save Zimbabwe for African ecotourism. We need to keep the people alive. Sometimes, some ways in which people in their egalitarians and naturalists act borders on what I call eco-fascism. I've tried to have input in some organizations, and I've learned it's a top-down kind of thing. People in London basically want shock troops or minions out there to do what they say. They are not interested in professors of bioethics in Birmingham giving them some input back. They tend to use dramatic, emotional things like intercepting whaleboats or images, and they don't really like to talk about cost-benefit analysis. So this is a little bit scary to me, because if you, this is what I'm about to say is the thing that gets me most in trouble, but I'll say it anyway. You go back and look at some of the things in Nazism, there are some things that are a little bit like this. You know, Hitler was a vegetarian, people were in this romanticism of the land, it was a really top-down kind of movement, and they weren't interested in cost-benefit analysis. That's a big stretch to say that, but it's, I guess the point is, the environment is not the only value in ethics. And sometimes people who are environmentalists act as if the environment was an absolute value that trumped all other values. And there's lots of other values, like saving people's lives and creating jobs and creating better antibiotics. And even some people just may not like the environment at all. And their views should have count too. So the environment is not an absolute value. There's one thing I will give naturalists. They are great at creating scary images. They have the best PR, and there's some scientists down at Tuskegee, food scientists, and they like to they believe that you can kind of argue people with the facts and logic, eventually people will come over to your side. But if you're going up that kind of image of Monsanto or Frankenfood, the other side wins. And what's going to be on TV is this. And the trouble is, it's very hard to come up with a counter kind of image if you're a scientific progressive. What counters that Frankenfood kind of image? It's very hard. I've never been able to think of anything that good. So GM veggies, I think, have become the flashpoint about in the battle. Certainly in Europe, because of mad cow disease, when Monsanto tried a stealth invasion of GM food, people were very scared of this and have reacted by resisting all kinds of genetically modified crops and food. And of course, other things are going on there, trade protectionism, and people see genetically modified corn and soybeans coming from Iowa as a kind of McDonaldization of their food way of life, and they don't like that, and they see it as a kind of American cultural imperialism. It's bad enough that they got Michael Jackson songs playing in the supermarkets, and they got American TV. Their kids always go to American movies. They don't go to European movies because European movies are dull and boring, and they hate that. But they're damned if they're going to have genetically modified food coming in, which they see as allied with the Bush administration and Republicans who support big farms. Well, if you look at corn, it's kind of interesting to think about how corn has been modified before. Corn has a long history. It's not as if the latest modifications are something new. Corn's been crossed and bred for many, many years. In fact, if you look at the thing on the right, I've got another slide of this, teosinte, this is the original corn. And this is the more modern form of corn on the left. And you can see it's had quite a lot of modification to get, and we wouldn't get a lot of food value from the stuff on the right. There's another way of comparing the ancient kind of primordial, it's got a poltergeist in here, corn from teosinte at the top with the modern version on the bottom. And obviously we get a lot more nutrition and value from doing this. And the world has not come to an end, the sky has not fallen, because we made that evolution. But in the traditional crosses, the genetic mixture was really kind of a hit or miss kind of procedure, and you might have to do hundreds, thousands of crosses to get the one you wanted. With the new selective moving of 1 or 2 genes or 6 genes, it's a much more precise mix that can be much more selective and much more powerfully target exactly what you want. So in some sense, it's safer. So in these 4 worldviews, I think the thing that 2 ways of what it comes down to is food safety, because no one wants to eat unsafe genetically modified food or meat, and trust. I'm going to talk about each of these 2 issues. What kind of standard do we want in food safety? Do we want a sort of absolute platonic perfection where there's absolutely no risk at ever in what we eat? I don't think that's really possible. You have to do away with all fast food, because in fast food, you're dependent on teenagers to follow the directions carefully and to burn that burger thoroughly so you don't get sick. We would probably have to do away with grocery stores to have no risk. Remember I talked about being more conscious of food? You know those rubber conveyor belts in the grocery store? Have you ever been in one and seen them, one of them kind of wet? You ever thought that maybe the person before you had like chickens, and that was chicken juice, and you put your apples down on the belt? Just think about that. Salmonella? Go home and take a bite of that apple without washing it? Right. I mean, that is risk. That's big risk. So probably have to do away with supermarkets if we had no risk at all. So we're going to probably accept some risk in return for the trade-off of convenience. We could also have food with no allergies, and we try to do that. We put a peanut gene in soybeans, and we found out it's a bad thing. People who have allergic peanuts couldn't eat it, so we didn't do it. So the testing system works. But some people have idiosyncratic reactions. We don't really know. We can't be absolutely perfect about that. You may not know this, but in the early days of penicillin, which is a wonderful drug, I mean, people used to die from infections before penicillin antibiotics, but some people have a severe reaction to penicillin, actually go into anaphylactic shock. So, you know, there's a cost-benefit ratio. We want antibiotics. We don't want to kill people. In the early days, in order to use penicillin, we actually probably killed some people to save thousands more. Probably a better standard is we hope the food won't kill us or make us sick. One of the really interesting things in thinking about food and being more conscious is to separate out the real risk versus the media perceived risk. And there's a book I recommend from the Harvard Center for Risk Analysis by a guy, I think his name is David Worovic. And he points out that the dangers of mad cow disease or GM veggies is minuscule, just speculative. On the other hand, the amazing thing, if you look at the CDC, is that about 70 million Americans, or North Americans, every year have an incidence of food poisoning. I have had this several times in my own past. This is suddenly you're sick, you want to puke, you have diarrhea, you don't really know what happened, but you know that you ate at that, I shouldn't even say a particular kind of restaurant, but you know something's gone wrong, really suddenly and fast. And the other amazing fact is that 5,000 Americans die every year because of food poisoning. This is everything from E. coli to salmonella to various kinds of bugs in the intestine. This is a kind of stealth issue that no one's talking about. And I think it's a big issue. And this is one of the reasons I think that food ethics is poised to really leap forward. All we need is kind of one case in CNN, another kind of jack-in-the-box case where the kids out in the Northeast got really sick, or there's a form of E. coli, OH157. It's a really deadly form that not a lot of people know about. But it's, 1 year, a couple years ago, it killed 2,000 people. I mean, this is like not even a blip on the media radar screen, that there's this risk out there in the food system. And one of the reasons it's such a big risk is that the way the industrial food system works, when people make 60,000-pound batches of hamburger, all these cows come together, and you have what used to be called, I used to do a lot of work in AIDS, people in public health call an amplification system. So with the gay bathhouses, you had an amplification system. With hemophiliacs and the clotting factor and plasma, you had an amplification system. The way hamburger is made, you have an amplification system for spreading disease, especially in the industrial food system. And that's something that we might really want to think about. Different worldviews say different things about food safety. Sometimes I think naturalism wants platonic perfection. And I think, on the other hand, globalists will be happy as long as the food doesn't kill us. Somewhere in between, we have to sort of figure out where we stand and what standard of food safety we want. Well, one way you can think about it is most people eat meat. I used to eat meat, and then I wrote a book and really started looking at the safety of meat. And I found that I used to be kind of a moral vegetarian because I didn't tried not to. I believe animals suffered in being raised for food, but I wasn't a good enough person to sustain that. And my wife didn't go along. That was a problem too. But when I started studying the meat system, I would say stuff to her like, "Do you know this? Do you know that the food inspectors really can't stop the line unless they see a rotting carcass, and that Phil Graham's wife, Kay, just basically emasculated the beef inspectors. The USDA inspected means nothing, and the hamburger is like soaked in E. coli, and they basically say, burn it. We know it's in there, but you got to burn the hamburger to make it safe." And basically what happened to us is that both of us lost, first all our desire for hamburger, then we lost all our desire for red meat, and basically now we're vegetarians. Not because we are sort of think we shouldn't, but we just can't do it. We can't ingest it. But if you eat meat, then you don't have anything to worry about if you eat GM veggies, because compared to the risk you take eating meat and going to that grocery store with that, wet rubber conveyor belt, genetically modified veggies are nothing. And as I'm going to tell you, you do some other risk in your life that you take that you may not realize. If you hunt elk and deer, especially in Wisconsin, I believe that deer don't respect state boundaries, and eat venison, especially with that spongiform encephalopathy, but we don't know what is going on. I think you're nuts. I would not eat that stuff, especially if you're under 30. I don't know if you young people know this, but of the 130 people that have died from mad cow disease, they're all under 30. Probably those of us who grew up eating meat have some kind of immunity, like we had people who had the great flu epidemic in 1918. For some reason, it only kills young people. They become rapidly spastic and kind of like that picture of that downer cow, and then vegetative and die a kind of horrible death. There's a girl who grew up in England, who's in Miami, who's basically like a PVS patient now, who has this VC variant Jakob-Creutzfeldt disease. On the other hand, if you don't think the meat system is safe, then this should challenge your view of confidence in whether genetically modified veggies are safe. Because if you don't trust the industrial system that's creating meat, maybe you're not going to trust the industrial system that's creating plants. And that's a legitimate point. I think you have a kind of conceptual linkage here. Certainly the people in England feel, to go on to the second practical issue, that there was a huge, big breakdown of trust in their system. And in a way, it wasn't really the scientists who were involved. It was the politicians who were implementing the policy that, based on selective intake of scientists, but basically it was the politicians calling the shot. In the same way, to go back to use the AIDS epidemic, Margaret Heckler, who in 1985 was our Tommy Thompson, head of Health and Human Services, assured Americans that the blood supply was safe. The hemophiliacs had nothing to worry about, and in 2 years we'd have a vaccine against AIDS. Well, about 80,000 hemophiliacs in this country died because they believed the blood system was safe. So you shouldn't always trust politicians when it comes to scientific policy. Who do you trust? Do you eat Altoids? Do you ever look at what is in an Altoid? Something called gelatin. You know where that comes from? Bone, also called bone meal. A spinal cord product. You know where Altoids are made? England. Think about that. Do you know what you're eating? Where it comes from? What about good old Jell-O? Remember Bill Cosby? There's always room for Jell-O, right? Where does the gelatin come from? Well, it comes from those products, and that are being banned now. Bone and spinal cord, which is thought to particularly carry those weird things called prions. I mean, what is a prion? Until recently, it was a kind of absolute truth that a protein cannot be infectious. And this guy named Stanley Prusiner went around saying, I don't think that's right. And people said, you're a kook. And he kept at it, and he got a Nobel Prize, and he basically proved that some proteins can be aberrant and seemingly cause infections. You cannot destroy them by radiation. You cannot destroy them by heating or freezing. They are really weird little critters, and we don't really know what's going on. We do know they can cross species barriers. We're pretty sure that mad cow disease basically came from scrappy spongiform encephalopathy in sheep. And and let's just review in case everybody doesn't know this. How did the cows get it? Because they were grinding up dead sheep with scrappy and feeding them to cows to give them more bulk. I mean, animals that naturally are not cannibals were sort of made cannibalistic, and then they were grinding this stuff up in a hamburger and feeding it to us. So we don't know how those prions jump species and cause the infection, but we know that something really weird's going on there. We don't actually know also why the elk and deer have the spongiform encephalopathy. We know from autopsies that their brains have the little holes in there. That's very bad. So I think basically it comes down to who do you trust. If you're pregnant, who do you trust? When you're pregnant, you're not just eating for one, but you're eating for two. And of course, the effects on a fetus can be little effects, very early, can be magnified much more later, so you have to be especially careful. I think the recent incidence of a mad cow, in this country was a real wake-up call, because that cow was caught by accident. The system that was in place now was designed not to detect any cows with mad cow disease. It is not a good system. And the Secretary of Agriculture has basically been a pro-business, cattle business person from the get-go, always. There is not a sort of consumer-oriented person that has real power in any administration, especially administration from Texas, a beef capital of the world. So there's a real legitimate point, I think, about whether we can trust our food system. And even though I personally think genetically modified vegetables are perfectly safe, the lack of trust in the global food system stresses the whole system. And in fact, my students, especially my Hindu students, say I'm a weird kind of vegetarian because I eat fish. But the more I learn about some of the salmon farms and the kind of cesspool of bacteria underneath them, the more I'm afraid I may have to give up fish too. My wife says that pretty soon we'll be just eating spaghetti and cornflakes. It is hard to trust the whole system when you find out that that all the shrimp you're eating were raised in the coast of Ecuador, or the catfish came from Vietnam, because there's so many links in that system that you wonder who's accountable if something goes wrong. As a result, one of the things we're seeing is a kind of backlash against globalism, and people are turning more to farmers markets and locally grown food. And in particular, there's a movement called slow food. And this means a lot of different things. It means it's the complete opposite of the drive-through McDonaldization of the world. Rather than sort of eating in your car, gulping it down, talking to your cell phone, it's the idea of having a sit-down meal kind of leisurely, the way Europeans like to think they always do, at a cafe, with a little red wine, good for your heart. But paying more attention to where your food comes from, whether you're buying from a sustainable source, and exactly what I'm saying here in terms of being more conscious about food, not just in terms of calories and fat, but the sources and the sustainability and the safety. And I think this is going to really take off. One of the reasons it's taking off is that people have found out, who sell food and who make food in restaurants, that people are willing to pay a lot more for slow food and organic food. So farmers and restaurateurs are getting a lot more profit, a lot more value, and because consumers perceive extra value in this. Alice Waters is kind of leading this movement out of her restaurant Chez Paniche, and seems to be taking off. It's also true that the more people get scared by mad cow, you see that the growth of organic food and slow food just, astronomical. It's kind of taken off. Some people accuse the Organic Food Association of planting that downer cow to increase their sales. That's too unkind. But when you're conscious, you have to be conscious across the board. And I found that people kind of give like naturalistic health food places a pass when it comes to this. That's a very dangerous thing. There's bad forms of E. coli that are in organically grown food. You've got to be careful about some of the alfalfa tips. Virtually every health food store used to sell ephedra until it's killed a bunch of people. But one of the most astonishing things I found living in the medical center is that you could go into a health food store and buy all kinds of weird untested stuff, kava, saw palmetto, whatever, and if like 200 people died from this, no one would know, because there's no reporting requirement to the FDA for anything that's sold in a health food store. There is for drugs. A physician and drug companies have to report adverse incidents, but not health food stores. So it's different in Europe, where kava has actually cost about a dozen people their livers. This is a bad thing, if your liver gets blown out. No more drinking. You can also get E. coli 157 if you drink the wrong kind of apple juice. You don't want apples that have fallen on manure piles. That's natural, but it's not good. So you have to be conscious not only about industrial food, but organic food. You can get caught either way. In my own health food organic store, there's a kind of irony that they have TV organic dinners that are sort of wrapped in plastic. And it's a double irony because most of these meals are actually prepared outside of Seattle and Vancouver. So you can imagine these 18-wheelers